In the unforgiving skies above hostile territory, where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, Captain Sarah Mitchell never imagined that the most dangerous moment of her military career wouldn't come from enemy fire, but from her own allies. What started as a routine close air support mission in her A-10 Warthog would spiral into a heart-stopping encounter that would test the very foundations of military protocol, international law, and human judgment. When two F-16 Fighting Falcons appeared on her wingtips that Tuesday morning, their pilots weren't there to escort her home safely. They were there to force her down. Weapons hot, fingers on triggers, ready to shoot down an American pilot flying an American aircraft. The reason? A tail number that didn't match their records, a bureaucratic nightmare that had turned deadly, and a chain of miscommunication that had branded Captain Mitchell as a potential enemy combatant in her own airspace. What happened next would expose critical flaws in military identification systems, challenge the rules of engagement that govern friendly fire incidents, and reveal how quickly allies can become threats when technology fails and human error compounds. This is the true story of how a decorated combat pilot found herself staring down the gun barrels of her own Air Force, and the split-second decisions that prevented an international incident from becoming a tragedy that would have echoed through military history forever. Captain Sarah Mitchell pulled her flight helmet over her short blonde hair and checked her watch. 0530 hours, and the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern horizon with streaks of orange and pink. The air was crisp at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, carrying the familiar scent of jet fuel and dust that had become as natural to her as morning coffee. She had been flying A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, affectionately known as Warthogs, for 6 years, and this Tuesday morning felt no different from hundreds of others that had come before it. Sarah walked around her aircraft, conducting the pre-flight inspection with practiced precision. The A-10 wasn't the prettiest bird in the sky, but it was built like a tank and could take punishment that would bring down sleeker fighter jets. Its massive GAU, 8 Avenger cannon, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute, jutted from the nose like the snout of some prehistoric beast. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage gave it an unmistakable silhouette, and the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit had saved countless pilots from ground fire. She traced her gloved hand along the aircraft's gray surface, checking for any damage or loose panels. Everything looked good. The tail number, 810975, was clearly visible in white letters against the dark gray paint. This particular Warthog had been her regular mount for the past 3 months, and she knew every rivet and wire on it. The ground crew had done their usual excellent job preparing the aircraft for combat operations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her crew chief, approached with a tablet in his hands. "Morning, Captain," he said with a slight Texas drawl. "She's ready to go. All systems checked out green, and we've loaded her up with the mix you requested. 2 Mavericks, full cannon rounds, and a full fuel load." "Thanks, Rodriguez. Any word from maintenance about that slight vibration I mentioned yesterday?" "They checked it out thoroughly, ma'am. Turns out it was just some turbulence from the auxiliary power unit. Nothing to worry about. She's as solid as they come." Sarah nodded and signed off on the maintenance log. Rodriguez had been working on A-10s for 12 years, and if he said the aircraft was ready, she trusted his judgment completely. The relationship between pilot and crew chief was sacred in the Air Force, built on mutual respect and absolute trust. When a pilot strapped into an aircraft, she was putting her life in the hands of the people who maintained it. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence indicated Taliban activity in a valley about 60 miles northeast of Bagram, near a village called Kare Bagh. Ground forces had requested close air support for what they expected to be a routine sweep and clear operation. Sarah would patrol the area, provide overwatch for the troops on the ground, and engage any targets of opportunity if they presented themselves. It was the kind of mission she had flown dozens of times before. As she climbed the ladder into the cockpit, Sarah felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came before every flight. No matter how routine a mission seemed on paper, combat flying was never truly routine. The enemy always got a vote, and mechanical failures, weather changes, or new intelligence could turn a simple patrol into a life-or-death situation in seconds. The cockpit of the A-10 was cramped but efficient, every switch and display positioned within easy reach. Sarah settled into the ejection seat and began the startup checklist, her hands moving through the familiar sequence of switches and buttons. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines came to life with a growing whine, and she could feel the aircraft coming alive around her. Bagram Tower, Hog 77, requesting taxi clearance for combat air patrol, she radioed. Hog 77, Bagram Tower. Taxi to runway 09, wind 080 at 10 knots. Contact departure on 254.7 when ready. Sarah released the brakes and began the slow taxi to the runway. The A-10 wasn't fast on the ground, but its wide landing gear made it stable and forgiving on rough airstrips. As she taxied past the flight line, she could see other aircraft preparing for their daily missions. F-16 Fighting Falcons sat on the ramp like sleek gray sharks, their pointed noses and swept wings a stark contrast to the brutish appearance of her Warthog. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah advanced the throttles. The A-10 accelerated slowly but steadily down the runway, and at exactly 150 knots, she pulled back on the stick. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and she raised the landing gear as Bagram fell away beneath her. Flying the A-10 was like driving a pickup truck compared to the sports car feel of faster fighter jets, but Sarah loved it. The aircraft was stable and predictable, and its powerful engines gave her the ability to loiter over a target area for hours if necessary. More importantly, it was incredibly tough. The A-10 had been designed to survive in a hostile environment, and its redundant systems and armored cockpit had saved many pilots who found themselves on the wrong end of enemy fire. She climbed to 8,000 feet and set course for the patrol area. The landscape below was a mixture of brown mountains and green valleys, dotted with small villages and irrigation canals. Afghanistan was actually quite beautiful from the air, though the beauty was deceptive. Those peaceful-looking valleys and ancient stone buildings often concealed fighters who would not hesitate to shoot down an American aircraft if given the chance. As she flew northeast, Sarah checked in with the ground controller who would be coordinating her mission. Dusty 7-1, this is Hog 7-7, checking in with 2 Mavericks and 900 rounds of 30mm. Station time approximately 3 hours. Hog 7-7, Dusty 7-1, good to have you overhead. We're about 20 minutes out from the objective. Nothing significant to report at this time, but we'll keep you posted. Sarah acknowledged and settled in for what she expected to be a routine patrol. She had no way of knowing that 800 miles away, in a secure communications center, a simple data entry error was about to turn her peaceful morning flight into the most dangerous mission of her career. The error occurred at exactly 0642 hours when a tired Air Force communications specialist named Airman First Class Thompson was updating the daily flight manifest. Thompson had been on duty for 10 hours and was looking forward to the end of his shift. When he entered the tail numbers of aircraft cleared for operations in Afghan airspace, he accidentally transposed 2 digits in Sarah's tail number. Instead of 810975, he entered 81.30795 into the system. It was a simple mistake, the kind that happens thousands of times in military operations around the world. Usually, such errors are caught and corrected quickly, but this particular error occurred during a shift change, and Thompson's replacement assumed that all the entries had been double-checked. The incorrect tail number was transmitted to air defense networks across the region, including the systems used by fighter aircraft to identify friendly and hostile aircraft. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her peaceful patrol, unaware that her aircraft's identity had just been erased from the friendly aircraft database. According to the computer systems that tracked aircraft movements across Afghanistan, tail number 810975 did not exist. Any aircraft bearing that number would be classified as unknown, and unknown aircraft in a combat zone were considered hostile until proven otherwise. The morning air was smooth, and Sarah found herself enjoying the flight. The landscape below was particularly beautiful today, with the early sunlight casting long shadows across the valleys and highlighting the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains in the distance. She had always been fascinated by the geography of Afghanistan, a country that had been the crossroads of ancient civilizations and modern conflicts. At 0715, she received her first call from the ground troops. Hog 77, Dusty 71. We're approaching the objective now. Everything looks quiet, but we'd like you to take a look at a compound about 2 clicks north of our position. Possible enemy activity. Sarah banked left and descended to get a better view of the compound. Through her targeting pod, she could see a collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall. Several vehicles were parked in the courtyard, but she couldn't see any obvious signs of hostile activity. Dusty 7-1, I have eyes on the compound. Negative on hostile activity at this time. I'll continue to monitor. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah circled the area while the ground troops conducted their sweep. The operation was proceeding smoothly, with no contact from enemy forces. It looked like it would be one of those rare missions where nothing significant happened, which was fine with Sarah. Boring missions meant everyone went home safely, but at 0745, her peaceful morning was shattered by an urgent radio call from an unfamiliar voice. Unknown aircraft bearing tail number 810975. This is Viper Flight. You are in restricted airspace without authorization. Identify yourself immediately. Sarah looked around, but didn't see any other aircraft in her vicinity. She checked her navigation system and confirmed that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, well within the boundaries of her assigned patrol area. Viper Flight, this is Hog 77. I am on an authorized combat air patrol mission. Please verify your position. Hog 77, negative on authorization. Your tail number does not appear in our database of friendly aircraft. You are directed to immediately change heading to 270 and proceed to Bagram Airfield for landing. Acknowledge immediately. Now Sarah was confused. She had taken off from Bagram less than 2 hours ago with full authorization. Her mission had been planned and briefed through proper channels, and she was exactly where her flight plan said she should be. Viper Flight. I am Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, flying an authorized mission. Check with Bagram Tower for confirmation. There was a long pause, and then a different voice came on the radio. This one was harder, more authoritative. Aircraft tail number 810975. This is Colonel Peterson, commanding officer of the 421st Fighter Squadron. You are flying in restricted airspace without proper authorization. If you do not immediately comply with instructions to proceed to Bagram for landing, we will consider you hostile and act accordingly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was unmistakable. She was being ordered to land by fighter aircraft that apparently didn't recognize her as friendly. But she was flying an American aircraft, wearing an American uniform, and operating under valid orders. How could there be any confusion about her identity? She tried a different approach. Colonel Peterson, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, serial number 445. 1279. I am flying A-10 tail number 810975 on a valid close air support mission. I request you contact Bagram Air Operations Center to verify my authorization. Negative, Captain Mitchell. Bagram has no record of an A-10 with that tail number being authorized for flight today. You will comply with instructions to land immediately. This was becoming a nightmare. Sarah knew that bureaucratic mix-ups happened in the military, but this was going beyond a simple paperwork error. She was being treated as a hostile aircraft by her own Air Force. She looked around the sky again and this time spotted 2 F-16s approaching from the southeast, still several miles away but closing rapidly. Her heart began to race as the implications of the situation became clear. These F-16s believed she was flying an unauthorized, possibly stolen aircraft. In their minds, she could be anyone from a rogue pilot to a terrorist who had somehow acquired an A-10. And if they truly believed she was hostile, they would not hesitate to shoot her down. Sarah's training kicked in, and she began to think through her options. She could comply with the order to land, but that would abandon the ground troops who were counting on her support. More importantly, something was clearly wrong with the identification system, and she wasn't sure that landing would resolve the situation. If the computers showed her aircraft as unauthorized, they might not believe her identity even after she was on the ground. On the other hand, if she didn't comply with the F-16's orders, they might interpret her actions as confirmation that she was hostile. Fighter pilots were trained to shoot first and ask questions later when dealing with unknown aircraft in a combat zone. She was caught in an impossible situation where following orders could be as dangerous as disobeying them. The F-16s were getting closer now, and Sarah could see their sleek forms clearly against the blue sky. These were dangerous aircraft, armed with air-to-air missiles and cannons that could destroy her Warthog in seconds. The A-10 was tough and could survive a lot of ground fire, but it was no match for dedicated fighter aircraft in air-to-air combat. Viper Flight, this is Hog 77, she radioed, trying to keep her voice steady. I am a United States Air Force pilot flying a valid mission under proper authority. I believe there has been a serious error in your identification systems. I request you verify my identity through alternative channels before taking any hostile action. Hog 77, you have 30 seconds to acknowledge orders to proceed immediately to Bagram Airfield. Failure to comply will result in the use of force. 30 seconds. Sarah looked at her watch and felt her mouth go dry. In 30 seconds, she would either have to abandon her mission and hope the F-16 pilots didn't shoot her down anyway, or she would have to take some kind of evasive action that would almost certainly be interpreted as a hostile act. Either choice could result in her death, and both choices would abandon the ground troops who were depending on her for support. She keyed her radio one more time, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would realize the mistake that was being made. All stations, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, flying A-10 tail number 810975 on authorized close air support mission. I am being threatened by F-16 aircraft who claim I am unauthorized. Request immediate assistance from any station to verify my identity and resolve this situation. The response came not from a helpful controller, but from the lead F-16 pilot, whose voice was now cold and professional. Hog 77, your time is up. Turn to heading 270 immediately and proceed to Bagram Airfield. This is your final warning. As Sarah watched the F-16s close to within a mile of her position, their missile pylons clearly visible under their wings, she realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived or died. The morning had started so peacefully, with a routine patrol over familiar territory. Now she found herself in the most dangerous situation of her military career, threatened not by enemy fighters or surface-to-air missiles, but by her own allies, who no longer recognized her as a friend. Sarah Mitchell's hands gripped the stick tighter as the two F-16s moved into flanking positions on either side of her A-10. She could see the pilots clearly now through their canopies, their helmets turned toward her aircraft, studying her every move. The lead aircraft, with the call sign Viper 1 painted on its nose, had positioned itself slightly ahead and to her left. The wingman, Viper 2, held position on her right side, about 500 feet away. Both fighters had their weapon systems powered up, as evidenced by the targeting radars she could see painted on her threat warning system. The situation was surreal. Here she was, a decorated American pilot flying an American aircraft over a combat zone where she had been specifically assigned to protect American troops, being treated as an enemy by other American pilots. The irony would have been almost funny if it weren't for the very real missiles hanging under the wings of the F-16s flanking her. Major Jake Harrison, flying Viper 1, had been in the Air Force for 12 years and had never encountered a situation quite like this. The aircraft he was escorting appeared to be a legitimate A-10 Warthog, complete with proper military markings and standard weapon loadout. The pilot sounded like an American military officer and was using correct radio procedures. But the tail number didn't match any aircraft in the database, and in a combat zone, that made the aircraft hostile by definition. Harrison keyed his radio and addressed his wingman. Viper 2, maintain position and keep your systems hot. If this bird makes any aggressive moves, we take it down immediately. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, flying Viper 2, acknowledged the order while studying the A-10 through her heads-up display. Something about this situation didn't feel right to her. She had intercepted hostile aircraft before, and they usually behaved differently. They either ran for the border, tried to hide among civilian traffic, or immediately became aggressive and tried to fight their way out. This pilot was doing none of those things. Instead, she was maintaining a steady course and altitude, following proper radio procedures, and consistently claiming to be a legitimate American military flight. Viper 1, this is 2, Rodriguez radioed on their private frequency. Something's not adding up here. This doesn't feel like a hostile aircraft to me. Copy that too, but we have our orders. Unknown aircraft in a combat zone is hostile until proven otherwise. The tail number doesn't match our database, and that's all the proof we need. Rodriguez wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer, but she was a good military officer and would follow orders. Still, she made a mental note to be extra careful about target identification before firing any weapons. In the confusion of combat, friendly fire incidents were always a possibility, and the last thing she wanted was to shoot down one of her own. Meanwhile, Sarah was desperately trying to think of a way out of this situation. She had considered several options, none of them particularly appealing. She could try to outrun the F-16s, but that was impossible. The Warthog's maximum speed was only about half that of the fighters, and they would easily catch her if she tried to run. She could try to hide by flying low among the mountains, but that would only delay the inevitable and would probably be interpreted as a hostile act anyway. Her best option seemed to be continued dialogue, hoping to convince someone that a mistake was being made. She keyed her radio again, this time addressing the broader command structure rather than just the fighters. Bagram Air Operations. This is Hog 77, urgent. I am being intercepted by F-16 aircraft who claim my tail number is not in their database. I am Captain Sarah Mitchell, flying A-10 tail number 810975 on a valid close air support mission authorized by your facility this morning. Please immediately verify my status and contact these fighters to resolve this situation. The response came not from Bagram Operations, but from a new voice that Sarah didn't recognize. Hog 77, this is Rattlesnake Control. We are monitoring your situation and attempting to resolve the identification discrepancy. Maintain current heading and altitude. Do not make any sudden maneuvers. This was encouraging. At least someone else was now involved in trying to sort out the mess. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that the situation might be resolved without anyone getting shot. But her optimism was short-lived. Rattlesnake Control, this is Viper 1. Major Harrison's voice cut through the radio chatter. We have been ordered to escort this aircraft to Bagram Airfield for immediate landing. The pilot has been given multiple warnings and has failed to comply. Request permission to use force if necessary. Viper 1, stand by, came the response from Rattlesnake Control. We are working to verify the aircraft's identity. Maintain escort position, but do not engage unless the aircraft takes aggressive action. Sarah breathed a small sigh of relief. At least someone was urging caution. But she knew that the situation was still extremely dangerous. All it would take was one misunderstood radio transmission, one unexpected maneuver, or one trigger-happy fighter pilot, and this standoff could turn deadly in seconds. The three aircraft continued flying in formation, heading generally toward Bagram Airfield, but not yet committed to landing there. Sarah used the time to try a different approach to proving her identity. She switched to the ground frequency and called the troops she had been supporting. Dusty 7-1, this is Hog 77. I need you to confirm my identity to air traffic control immediately. I'm being intercepted by friendly fighters who think I'm hostile. Staff Sergeant Williams, the ground controller with the Army unit, was confused by the transmission. Hog 77, say again? Did you say you're being intercepted by friendlies? That's affirmative, Dusty. I need you to contact Bagram Operations and confirm that I am the A-10 pilot who has been supporting your mission this morning. Use my voice as identification if necessary. End of story. Williams looked around at his fellow soldiers, all of whom were equally puzzled by the strange request. But he had been working with Hog 77 all morning. Roger, Hog 77. We'll contact higher and get this sorted out. While Williams was making his radio calls, the situation in the air was becoming more tense. Major Harrison was growing impatient with what he saw as a continued failure to comply with lawful orders. From his perspective, he had given the unknown aircraft multiple opportunities to land peacefully, and the pilot was continuing to stall and make excuses. Hog 77, this is Viper 1. You have been ordered to proceed immediately to Bagram Airfield for landing. Your continued failure to comply is being interpreted as a hostile act. Turn to heading 270 now, or we will be forced to take action. Sarah could hear the increasing hostility in the F-16 pilot's voice. She was running out of time and options. Viper 1, I am complying with your escort, but I cannot abandon the ground troops who are depending on my support without proper authorization from my chain of command. I am trying to verify my identity through proper channels. Negative. Hog 77. You are an unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. Your claims of supporting ground troops cannot be verified because your mission does not exist in our database. You will land immediately. At this point, Captain Rodriguez in Viper 2 was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She had been listening to the radio exchanges, and something was definitely wrong. The pilot of the A-10 was speaking in clear, professional military terminology. Her radio procedures were perfect. She knew the proper frequencies and call signs. Most importantly, she seemed genuinely confused and concerned about abandoning ground troops, which was exactly the kind of thing a real A-10 pilot would worry about. Rodriguez decided to take a risk and speak up. Viper 1, this is 2. Request permission to contact Bagram Operations directly to double-check the aircraft database. Major Harrison was not pleased with his wingman's suggestion. Negative. 2. We have our orders and our procedures. Unknown aircraft is hostile. End of discussion. But Rodriguez persisted. Viper 1. I've been watching this aircraft for 15 minutes now, and nothing about its behavior suggests hostile intent. The pilot is following proper procedures, claims to be supporting ground troops, and hasn't made a single aggressive move. I think we should verify the identification before we do anything irreversible. The exchange between the two F-16 pilots was being monitored by Sarah, and she felt a surge of gratitude toward Captain Rodriguez. At least one of the fighter pilots was thinking clearly and asking the right questions. Maybe there was still hope for a peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, back at Bagram Airfield, the situation was causing considerable confusion in the Air Operations Center. Colonel Matthews, the operations officer, had been awakened from a short nap by urgent reports of an unauthorized A-10 in the area. When he arrived at the operations center and began reviewing the situation, he immediately noticed several inconsistencies. According to the flight schedule, Captain Sarah Mitchell had indeed taken off that morning in A-10 tail number 810975 for a close air support mission. The mission had been properly authorized and briefed through normal channels. But when he checked the computer database that tracked authorized aircraft, there was no record of tail number 810975 being cleared for flight. Colonel Matthews was an experienced officer who had seen his share of bureaucratic mix-ups, and this had all the hallmarks of a classic administrative error. Someone, somewhere, had made a mistake in data entry, and now a perfectly legitimate mission was being treated as a hostile incursion. The problem was figuring out where the error had occurred and fixing it before someone got killed. He turned to the senior air traffic controller on duty. Chief, I need you to pull up all the documentation for Captain Mitchell's flight this morning. Authorization, flight plan, aircraft assignment, everything. And I need it now. Chief Master Sergeant Johnson began pulling files and cross-referencing databases. Within minutes, he had found the discrepancy. Sir, I've got it. Look at this. He pointed to two different documents on his computer screen. The flight authorization shows tail number 810975, but the air defense database shows 810795. Someone transposed the digits when they entered the data. Colonel Matthews felt relief and anger in equal measure. Relief that they had found the error before someone got shot down, and anger that such a simple mistake had created such a dangerous situation. Get me on the radio with those F-16s immediately, he ordered, and patch me through to Rattlesnake Control. We need to stop this before it goes any further. But even as Colonel Matthews was working to resolve the situation on the ground, the tension in the air was reaching a critical point. Major Harrison's patience had finally run out, and he was preparing to take more decisive action. Hog 77, this is your final warning. Turn to heading 270 immediately and begin descent to Bagram Airfield. If you do not comply within 60 seconds, I will consider you hostile and act accordingly. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. The F-16 pilot was clearly prepared to shoot her down if she didn't comply. But she still had no authorization from her chain of command to abandon her mission. She was caught between two competing sets of orders, and following either one could result in court-martial proceedings or worse. She made a desperate decision to buy more time. Viper 1, I am beginning a turn toward Bagram at this time, but I am also requesting immediate contact with my squadron commander to verify orders. Can you give me 2 minutes to establish communication? Major Harrison watched as the A-10 began a slow left turn toward Bagram Airfield. The pilot seemed to be complying with his orders, which was encouraging. But he was also aware that this could be a delaying tactic while the pilot figured out some other plan. He decided to give her the requested 2 minutes, but no longer. Roger, Hog 77. You have 2 minutes to establish communication with your chain of command. but you will continue heading toward Bagram Airfield during that time. Any deviation from that course will be considered a hostile act. As the three aircraft continued their tense flight toward Bagram, Sarah desperately tried to reach someone in her chain of command who could resolve this. She switched between multiple radio frequencies, trying to contact her squadron operations center, her wing headquarters, and anyone else who might be able to verify her identity and mission status. Finally, she heard a familiar voice on the radio. "Hog 77, this is Bulldog Operations. We've been monitoring your situation and are working to resolve it. Continue toward Bagram as directed and maintain radio contact. Help is on the way." It was her squadron operations officer, Major Peterson, and hearing his voice was the most welcome sound Sarah had experienced all day. If her own squadron was now involved in resolving the situation, there was hope that the deadly misunderstanding could be cleared up before anyone got killed. But as the aircraft continued toward Bagram, with the F-16s maintaining their threatening escort positions, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. Even if the identification error was resolved, there would be questions about how such a serious mistake could have occurred, and whether proper procedures had been followed by all parties involved. The next few minutes would determine not only whether she lived or died, but also whether her military career would survive the aftermath of this unprecedented incident. The tension in the cockpit of Viper 1 was palpable as Major Harrison struggled with a decision that could define the rest of his career. Through his headset, he could hear multiple radio conversations happening simultaneously as various command centers tried to sort out the identification crisis. But his training and his orders were clear. Unknown aircraft in a combat zone were hostile until proven otherwise, and this A-10's tail number remained unverified in his database. What made the situation particularly challenging was that the pilot of the Warthog continued to sound and act like a legitimate military officer. Her radio procedures were flawless, her flight patterns were consistent with standard close air support missions, and her genuine concern for the ground troops she claimed to be supporting seemed authentic. But Harrison had seen enemy pilots who were well-trained in American procedures, and he knew that deception was a common tactic in warfare. His wingman's earlier concerns were also weighing on his mind. Captain Rodriguez had always been a sharp officer with good instincts, and her suggestion that something wasn't right about this intercept deserved consideration. But Harrison also knew that hesitation in combat could be fatal, and his responsibility was to protect American forces from any potential threat, regardless of how convincing that threat might appear to be. The radio crackled with another transmission from Bagram Operations. Viper 1. This is Colonel Matthews, Bagram Air Operations. We are investigating a possible data entry error that may have caused this identification problem. Request you maintain escort position but do not engage unless the aircraft takes clearly hostile action. Harrison acknowledged the transmission but remained skeptical. Data entry errors were certainly possible, but they were also a convenient excuse that enemy forces might use if they were caught operating stolen or disguised aircraft. Until he received definitive proof that the A-10 was legitimate, he would continue to treat it as hostile. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was experiencing the most stressful flight of her entire aviation career. Every few seconds, she glanced at the F-16s flanking her aircraft, knowing that they could end her life with the press of a button. The Sidewinder missiles under their wings were clearly visible, and she knew that if those missiles were fired, her heavily armored A-10 would provide no protection whatsoever. She had managed to establish intermittent radio contact with her squadron operations center, but the communications were being complicated by the number of different agencies now involved in trying to resolve the crisis. Air traffic control, military intelligence, squadron operations, wing headquarters, and fighter command were all trying to coordinate their efforts, and the multiple overlapping radio transmissions were creating confusion rather than clarity. Hog 77, this is Major Peterson, your squadron operations officer, came a welcome voice through the static. We're working with Bagram Operations to verify your mission status. Continue complying with the F-16 escort, but do not land until we get this sorted out. We believe there's been a serious error in the identification database. This put Sarah in an even more difficult position. Her squadron was telling her not to land while the F-16s were demanding that she land immediately. Following either set of orders would mean directly disobeying the other, and she wasn't sure which carried more legal authority in this situation. She decided to try once more to reason with the F-16 pilots. Viper 1, this is Hog 77. My squadron operations officer is now instructing me not to land until this identification issue is resolved. I am caught between competing orders and request guidance on how to proceed. Major Harrison's response was immediate and sharp. Hog 7, you are under escort by armed fighter aircraft operating under direct orders from Theater Command. Squadron operations does not have authority to override those orders. You will continue to Bagram Airfield for immediate landing. The standoff was reaching a critical point, with both sides becoming more entrenched in their positions. Sarah knew that she couldn't continue flying indefinitely with armed escorts, and she was running low on options. But landing at Bagram under these circumstances could result in her being arrested as a suspected hostile agent, even if her identity was eventually verified. At that moment, the situation took an unexpected turn. Captain Rodriguez, flying Viper 2, noticed something on her radar display that changed everything. A new contact had appeared, approaching their position from the east at high speed. According to her identification system, it was another F-16, but this one was squawking a friendly identification code and was on an intercept course with their formation. Viper 1, this is 2, Rodriguez radioed urgently. I have a new contact approaching from the east. Single F-16, squawking friendly but not on our frequency. He's coming in fast and appears to be heading directly for us. Harrison quickly spotted the new aircraft on his own radar and immediately recognized the potential for a dangerous situation. Having multiple fighter aircraft in close proximity, especially when tensions were already high, was a recipe for disaster. Viper 2, maintain position on the Hog. I'll handle the new contact. He switched to the guard frequency, which all military aircraft monitored and transmitted a warning. Unknown F-16 approaching from the east. This is Viper 1. Identify yourself and state your intentions immediately. The response came from a voice that both F-16 pilots recognized immediately. Viper 1, this is Colonel James Morrison, 421st Fighter Squadron Commander. I am ordering you to break off your intercept immediately and return to base. There has been a critical error in the identification system, and the A-10 you are escorting is a legitimate friendly aircraft. Major Harrison felt his world shift beneath him. His own squadron commander was countermanding his orders and claiming that the A-10 was friendly. But Harrison had been operating under direct orders from the same squadron, and he wasn't sure how to reconcile the conflicting information. Colonel Morrison, this is Major Harrison. I am operating under your direct orders to intercept and escort an unknown A-10 with unverified tail number. The aircraft has failed to comply with repeated orders to land. Request clarification of my current orders. Colonel Morrison's voice was tense but controlled. Major Harrison, there has been a serious error in our computer systems. The A-10 you are escorting is being flown by Captain Sarah Mitchell on a legitimate close air support mission. Her tail number was incorrectly entered into our database, causing her to be classified as hostile. You are ordered to immediately break off the intercept and allow the A-10 to continue its mission. It should have resolved the situation immediately, but Major Harrison found himself in an unprecedented dilemma. He had been given direct orders by what appeared to be his squadron commander, but those orders contradicted everything he had been told for the past hour. In a combat environment, the possibility of enemy deception was always present, and he had no way to immediately verify that the voice on the radio was actually Colonel Morrison. Sir, I need verification of your identity before I can comply with those orders. Can you provide authentication codes? There was a pause, and then Colonel Morrison's voice returned, clearly frustrated. Major Harrison, I understand your caution, but we don't have time for elaborate authentication procedures. I am ordering you to stand down immediately. The A-10 pilot's life may depend on it. Captain Rodriguez, meanwhile, had been listening to the exchange and was relieved that higher authority was finally intervening to resolve the situation. But she also understood Major Harrison's hesitation. In the fog of war, nothing was ever simple, and the possibility of deception was always present. Sarah Mitchell, listening to the radio traffic, felt a surge of hope as she heard her squadron commander's voice. But she also realized that the situation was still far from resolved. The F-16 pilots were clearly struggling with conflicting orders and uncertain identification, and until that was sorted out, she remained in mortal danger. She decided to try to help resolve the authentication issue. Colonel Morrison, this is Captain Mitchell. Can you provide information that would verify your identity to the F-16 pilots? Perhaps something about our squadron or recent operations that only the real commander would know? Colonel Morrison immediately understood what she was asking. Major Harrison, 3 days ago in our squadron briefing room, you asked about the maintenance status of aircraft 840197, which had been having hydraulic problems. I told you that it would be down for at least a week pending parts delivery. Does that help verify my identity? Harrison remembered the conversation clearly. It had been a routine discussion about aircraft availability, but it was the kind of specific detail that would be very difficult for an enemy agent to know. Yes, sir, I remember that conversation. But I need to ask one more verification question. What was the call sign of the pilot who had the bird strike incident last month? That was Captain Williams, call sign Goose. The bird went through his left engine intake during a low-level training flight. He made a successful single-engine landing at Nellis. That was enough for Harrison. The details were too specific and too recent for anyone other than the real Colonel Morrison to know. Roger, sir. I accept your authentication. Viper flight is breaking off the intercept at this time. As the two F-16s banked away from Sarah's A-10, she felt a relief so profound that she almost started crying. For the past hour, she had been living with the very real possibility that she might be shot down by her own Air Force due to a bureaucratic error. The psychological stress had been almost unbearable. Colonel Morrison, this is Captain Mitchell. Thank you for resolving this situation. Request permission to return to my original mission and continue supporting the ground troops. Permission granted, Captain Mitchell. But I want you to check in with operations every 15 minutes for the rest of your flight. We're going to have a lot of paperwork to sort out when you get back, and I want to make sure we don't have any more identification problems. As Sarah turned back toward her original patrol area, she reflected on how quickly a routine mission had turned into a life-threatening situation. The error that had caused the crisis was simple enough. Just 2 transposed digits in a computer database. But in a combat environment, simple errors could have catastrophic consequences. She also thought about the professionalism of the F-16 pilots who had been escorting her. While the situation had been terrifying from her perspective, she recognized that they had been doing their job correctly according to the information they had been given. Major Harrison had been following proper procedures for dealing with unknown aircraft, and Captain Rodriguez had shown good judgment in questioning the situation when something didn't seem right. The real lesson, Sarah realized, was about the critical importance of accurate data and clear communication in military operations. In an era of advanced technology and sophisticated computer systems, it was easy to forget that those systems were only as good as the humans who operated them. A single typing error by a tired airman had nearly resulted in a friendly fire incident that could have killed an American pilot and possibly started an international investigation. As she resumed her patrol over the Afghan countryside, Sarah noticed that her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the encounter. She took several deep breaths and tried to focus on the mission at hand. The ground troops were still depending on her for support, and she had a job to do. But in the back of her mind, she knew that this incident would follow her for the rest of her career. There would be investigations, reports, and probably changes to procedures designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The military took friendly fire incidents very seriously, even when no shots were actually fired, and everyone involved would be scrutinized to determine what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. For now, though, she was alive, she was flying, and she had a mission to complete. The morning that had started so peacefully had turned into one of the most dangerous and stressful experiences of her life, but she had survived it. As she settled back into her patrol pattern, Sarah Mitchell couldn't help but think that this was definitely going to be one war story that would be hard for anyone to believe. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield was packed with officers from multiple commands, all trying to understand how a routine close air support mission had nearly resulted in an American pilot being shot down by American fighters. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat at one end of the long conference table, still wearing her flight suit, which bore faint sweat stains from the stress of her morning encounter. Across from her sat Major Harrison and Captain Rodriguez, the F-16 pilots who had escorted her at gunpoint just hours earlier. Colonel Morrison, the squadron commander who had ultimately resolved the crisis, stood at the head of the table with a grim expression. Next to him was Colonel Matthews from Bagram Operations, Brigadier General Thompson from the Air Operations Center, and several intelligence officers whose job it was to investigate any incident that could potentially compromise operational security. Let me start by saying that this incident represents one of the most serious breakdowns in our identification and coordination systems that I have seen in 20 years of military service. General Thompson began. We came within minutes, possibly seconds, of a friendly fire incident that could have resulted in the death of one of our pilots and created an international incident. I want to understand exactly how this happened and ensure it never happens again. The general turned to a young airman sitting nervously at the side of the table. Airman First Class Thompson had been identified as the source of the data entry error that had triggered the crisis, and he looked as though he wished he could disappear through the floor. Airman Thompson, I want you to walk us through exactly what happened during your shift last night. Take your time and be as detailed as possible. Thompson cleared his throat and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I was entering the daily flight manifest into the Air Defense Database around 0640 hours. I had been on duty for 10 hours and was near the end of my shift. When I entered Captain Mitchell's tail number, I accidentally transposed 2 digits. Instead of 8100975, I entered 8107955. And what happened after you made that entry? I completed the rest of the manifest and prepared to hand over my duties to the incoming shift. The system didn't flag any errors, so I assumed everything was correct. I didn't double-check the entries before submitting them. General Thompson nodded grimly. And the incoming shift supervisor, did he verify your entries? No, sir. Shift change procedures normally include a verification step, but Staff Sergeant Wilson assumed that I had already checked everything. He signed off on the manifest without reviewing the individual entries. The general turned to another officer at the table. Major Kim, you're our computer systems specialist. Explain to me why our identification system didn't catch this error. Major Kim, a soft-spoken officer with thick glasses, referred to a stack of technical reports. Sir, the system is designed to flag aircraft that appear in one database but not in others. But in this case, the error created a situation where the aircraft appeared to exist in some systems but not in others. Tail number 8100975 was authorized for flight and appeared in the Flight Operations Database, but tail number 8100795 was what got entered into the Air Defense Database. So when Captain Mitchell's aircraft was detected with tail number 8100975, the air defense system had no record of it? Exactly, sir. From the computer's perspective, an unauthorized aircraft was operating in controlled airspace. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It flagged the aircraft as potentially hostile and triggered the intercept protocols. Colonel Morrison spoke up. General, I think we also need to examine the human factors that contributed to this incident. The computer error was the trigger, but the situation was escalated by communication failures and inflexibility in applying our procedures. General Thompson gestured for him to continue. Major Harrison was following proper procedures for dealing with unknown aircraft, but there were multiple opportunities to verify Captain Mitchell's identity that weren't pursued aggressively enough. We have voice recognition capabilities, ground force confirmation, and multiple alternative authentication methods that could have been used to resolve the situation more quickly. Major Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been dreading this moment, knowing that his actions would be scrutinized and second-guessed by officers who hadn't been in the cockpit, dealing with an unknown aircraft in a combat zone. Sir, with respect, I followed established procedures for unknown aircraft intercepts. The tail number didn't match our database, and that's the primary method of aircraft identification in a combat environment. Voice recognition and other authentication methods are secondary measures that take time to implement, and I was concerned about the aircraft's continued non-compliance with orders to land. Captain Mitchell spoke up for the first time since the debriefing began. General, if I may, I think Major Harrison acted appropriately given the information he had. From his perspective, I was an unknown aircraft that was refusing to comply with orders. So, his caution probably prevented what could have been a much worse situation if I had actually been a hostile aircraft. The general looked surprised by Mitchell's defense of the pilot, who had been prepared to shoot her down. Captain Mitchell, that's very generous of you, but I'm interested in your perspective on what went wrong and how we can prevent it in the future. Sarah had been thinking about this question throughout the morning, and she had some strong opinions about the weaknesses she had observed in the system. Sir, I think the biggest problem is that we've become too dependent on computer databases for aircraft identification. When the computer said my tail number didn't exist, everyone accepted that as absolute truth without questioning whether the computer might be wrong. She paused and looked around the room. We also have inadequate backup procedures for when the primary identification system fails. I was able to communicate with ground forces who could verify my identity. I was following proper radio procedures, and my aircraft was clearly marked with USCM, Air Force insignia. But none of that seemed to matter because the computer said I didn't belong there. Major Harrison nodded. Captain Mitchell makes a good point. Once the computer flagged her as hostile, it became very difficult to prove otherwise. The burden of proof shifted to her to prove she was legitimate rather than requiring positive confirmation that she was hostile. Brigadier General Thompson was taking notes as he listened to the discussion. This was exactly the kind of systemic analysis he needed to prevent future incidents. What about our communication procedures? It took far too long to get the right people involved in resolving this crisis. Colonel Matthews from Bagram Operations answered this question. Sir, we have multiple agencies involved in air traffic control and air defense, and they don't always communicate effectively with each other. When the crisis began, the F-16 pilots were getting their orders from Fighter Command. Captain Mitchell was trying to communicate through her squadron, and ground forces were working through Army channels. It took time to get everyone on the same communication network. How long from the start of the incident until my intervention resolved it? Asked Colonel Morrison. Approximately 67 minutes, Matthews replied. That's far too long for this type of situation. The general agreed. In 67 minutes, a lot of damage can be done. We need much faster procedures for resolving identification disputes, especially when American lives are at stake. The discussion continued for several more hours, with each participant providing their perspective on what had gone wrong and how to fix it. Several themes emerged that would eventually become the basis for new procedures and training programs. First, the military would implement redundant data entry procedures for critical databases. No single person would be able to enter aircraft identification data without verification from a second operator. Computer systems would also be modified to flag unusual aircraft registrations and require additional confirmation before processing them. Second, new communication protocols would be established to ensure that identification disputes could be resolved quickly. A single command center would be designated to coordinate between air traffic control, fighter command, and squadron operations when questions arose about aircraft identity. Third, fighter pilots would receive additional training on alternative authentication methods and would be required to pursue multiple verification procedures before engaging unknown aircraft. While computer databases would remain the primary identification method, pilots would be trained to recognize situations where the database might be unreliable. Finally, crew rest and shift change procedures would be reviewed and strengthened to reduce the likelihood of human errors like the one that had triggered this incident. Critical data entry positions would require two-person verification, especially during shift changes when fatigue was most likely to cause mistakes. As the debriefing session concluded, General Thompson addressed the participants one final time. I want to emphasize that while this incident was serious, it also demonstrates that our systems worked in many important ways. Captain Mitchell maintained her professionalism under extreme pressure. Major Harrison and Captain Rodriguez followed proper procedures and showed appropriate caution when dealing with an unknown aircraft. Colonel Morrison intervened decisively when he recognized that an error had occurred, and most importantly, no one was killed or injured. He paused and looked around the room. However, we cannot ignore the fact that we came very close to a tragedy that could have been prevented. Everyone involved in this incident will receive additional training, and the procedural changes we've discussed will be implemented immediately across all air operations in the theater. The general closed his folder and stood up. Captain Mitchell, I want to commend you for your courage and professionalism during this incident. You maintained your composure in an extremely difficult situation and helped prevent it from escalating further. Your squadron commander has recommended you for a commendation, and I will be supporting that recommendation. As the officers filed out of the debriefing room, Sarah found herself walking next to Major Harrison. The pilot, who had been prepared to shoot her down just hours earlier, looked at her with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I know I was just doing my job, but I put you through hell this morning based on incomplete information." Sarah shook her head. "Major, you don't owe me any apology. You were protecting American forces from what you believed was a potential threat. In different circumstances, your caution might have saved lives. I just wish our systems were better at preventing these kinds of misunderstandings." Harrison nodded gratefully. "I hope we never have to meet again under similar circumstances."
"Agreed," Sarah replied with a slight smile.
"Next time, let's try to be on the same side from the beginning." As she walked back to her squadron's operations center, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. She had started the morning expecting to fly a routine patrol mission, and instead had experienced one of the most dangerous and stressful situations of her military career. But she had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of calm thinking under pressure, the limitations of technology, and the critical role of human judgment in life-or-death situations. The incident would become a case study at military academies and pilot training programs for years to come, cited as an example of how small errors can cascade into major crises and how proper procedures and clear thinking can prevent tragedies even when systems fail. For Sarah Mitchell, it would always be remembered as the day she was almost shot down by her own Air Force, and the day she learned that survival sometimes depends as much on bureaucratic competence as on flying skills. 6 months after the incident that nearly cost Captain Sarah Mitchell her life, the effects were still rippling through the Air Force command structure. The near-friendly fire encounter had become known throughout the military as the Bagram incident, and it had fundamentally changed how the Air Force approached aircraft identification and intercept procedures in combat zones around the world. Sarah sat in her new office at the Pentagon, where she had been temporarily assigned to help implement the reforms that had grown out of the investigation into her case. Her official title was Special Assistant for Air Combat Identification Procedures, and her job was to work with systems engineers, training specialists, and operational commanders to ensure that no other pilot would face the same situation she had experienced over Afghanistan. The assignment was both an honor and a burden. On one hand, it represented recognition of her expertise and her unique perspective as someone who had lived through an identification crisis. On the other hand, it meant reliving the most terrifying experience of her life on a daily basis as she reviewed similar incidents, analyzed failure modes, and developed new procedures designed to prevent future problems. Her work had already produced significant changes. The new Aircraft Identification Verification System, known as AIVs, required multiple confirmation steps before any aircraft could be classified as hostile. Computer databases now included redundant verification protocols, voice recognition software, and real-time cross-referencing with multiple data sources. Perhaps most importantly, the system now included a mandatory cooling-off period for intercept situations, during which multiple verification methods had to be attempted before any weapons could be authorized for use. The human factors that had contributed to the incident had also been addressed through comprehensive changes to training and procedures. Data entry for critical systems now required two-person verification, with mandatory double-checking during shift changes. Communication protocols had been streamlined to ensure that identification disputes could be resolved through a single command center, rather than through multiple agencies that might not coordinate effectively. Fighter pilot training had been extensively revised to emphasize alternative identification methods and de-escalation techniques. Pilots now spent significant time learning to recognize situations where computer systems might be unreliable, and they were taught to pursue multiple verification procedures before considering the use of force against unknown aircraft. The changes had not been implemented without resistance. Some operational commanders argued that the new procedures were too complicated and would slow down response times in genuine emergency situations. Fighter pilots complained that the additional verification requirements might give hostile aircraft additional time to escape or carry out attacks. Budget analysts questioned the cost of implementing new computer systems and training programs across the entire Air Force, but the lessons of the Bagram incident were too clear to ignore. The investigation had revealed that similar identification errors had occurred dozens of times in the previous year, though none had escalated to the point of nearly shooting down friendly aircraft. In several cases, only luck or exceptional individual judgment had prevented tragedies. Moreover, The incident had highlighted fundamental weaknesses in the Air Force's approach to technology and human factors. The service had become so dependent on computer systems that personnel had lost the ability to think critically when those systems provided questionable information. The emphasis on speed and decisiveness in combat situations had created a culture where questioning orders or seeking additional verification was discouraged. Sarah's role in implementing the reforms had given her a unique perspective on how large organizations adapt to crisis. She had observed the bureaucratic inertia that resisted change, the political considerations that influenced decisions, and the genuine dedication of individuals who were committed to preventing future tragedies. The process had been frustrating at times, but she had also seen evidence that the military was capable of learning from its mistakes and implementing meaningful improvements. One of the most important changes had been the creation of the Friendly Fire Prevention Center, a specialized organization dedicated to investigating near-miss incidents and identifying systemic problems before they resulted in actual casualties. Sarah had been instrumental in designing the center's procedures and training programs, drawing on her experience to help other personnel understand the psychological and operational factors that contributed to identification failures. The center's work had already identified several other potential problem areas. Navigation system errors had caused aircraft to appear in unexpected locations, confusing air traffic controllers and triggering unnecessary alerts. Communication equipment failures had prevented pilots from responding to identification requests, leading to assumptions that they were hostile. Maintenance problems had caused aircraft transponders to broadcast incorrect identification codes, creating confusion about aircraft identity and mission status. Each of these problems was being addressed through targeted improvements to equipment, procedures, and training. But Sarah recognized that the work would never be finished. Technology would continue to evolve, creating new opportunities for error. Personnel would continue to make mistakes, especially under the stress of combat operations. The challenge was to build systems that were resilient enough to prevent individual errors from cascading into major failures. The personal cost of the incident had been significant for everyone involved. Airman First Class Thompson, the young man whose data entry error had triggered the crisis, had been transferred to a non-critical position and had received additional training. While he had not been formally punished, since his error was deemed inadvertent, the incident had effectively ended his prospects for advancement in his current career field. Major Harrison and Captain Rodriguez had both received additional training and had been commended for their professionalism during the incident. However, Harrison in particular had struggled with the psychological impact of nearly shooting down a fellow American pilot. He had sought counseling through the Air Force's mental health services and had taken a temporary assignment to a training command where he could share his experience with other fighter pilots. Colonel Morrison, the squadron commander who had ultimately resolved the crisis, had been promoted and assigned to a higher headquarters where he could influence policy development across multiple units. His decisive intervention had been cited as an example of effective leadership under pressure, and he had become a sought-after speaker at military leadership conferences. For Sarah herself, the incident had been both traumatic and transformative. The memory of sitting in her cockpit with armed F-16s on her wingtips, knowing that a single misunderstood radio transmission could result in her death, would stay with her forever. She had experienced nightmares and anxiety attacks in the weeks following the incident and had worked with military psychologists to process the trauma. But the experience had also given her a sense of purpose that she had never felt before in her military career. Her work on identification systems and friendly fire prevention was directly saving lives, and she received regular feedback from pilots and commanders who had benefited from the new procedures and training programs. She had found a way to turn her traumatic experience into something positive that would protect other military personnel for years to come. The broader implications of the Bagram incident had extended beyond the military to civilian aviation and international relations. The Federal Aviation Administration had studied the incident and had implemented similar verification procedures for civilian aircraft operating in sensitive areas. Other nations had examined their own identification systems and had discovered similar vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. The incident had also influenced international discussions about rules of engagement and friendly fire prevention. Military organizations around the world had recognized that modern combat operations involved such complex technology and communication systems that traditional identification methods were no longer sufficient. New international protocols had been developed to reduce the likelihood of friendly fire incidents between Allied forces operating in the same areas. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had demonstrated the critical importance of human judgment in an era of increasing automation. While computer systems and advanced technology were essential for modern military operations, the Bagram incident had shown that humans needed to remain actively engaged in decision-making processes, especially when lives were at stake. As Sarah completed her assignment at the Pentagon and prepared to return to operational flying, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying morning over Afghanistan. The Air Force was safer and more capable because of the lessons learned from her experience. Pilots were better trained to handle identification crises. Computer systems were more reliable and included better safeguards against human error. Communication procedures were clearer and more efficient. But she also recognized that the work of preventing friendly fire incidents would never be completely finished. Each new technology would bring new opportunities for error. Each new conflict would present unique challenges that existing procedures might not address. The key was to maintain the institutional memory of incidents like the one she had experienced, and to continue learning and adapting based on new information and changing circumstances. On her last day at the Pentagon, Sarah received a letter from a young fighter pilot who had benefited from the new training programs. The pilot had encountered a situation similar to the Bagram incident during a training exercise, but the new verification procedures had quickly resolved the identification problem before it escalated. The pilot wanted to thank Sarah for her role in developing the procedures that had prevented what could have been a dangerous situation. Reading the letter, Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Her terrifying experience had not been in vain. The improvements that had grown out of the Bagram incident were already saving lives and preventing tragedies. The military had learned from its mistakes and had become better at protecting its own personnel. As she prepared to return to flying combat missions, Sarah knew that she would never forget the morning when she was almost shot down by her own Air Force. But she also knew that the incident had ultimately made her a better pilot, a better officer, and a better human being. She had stared death in the face and had survived to help ensure that other pilots would not have to face the same danger. The tail number 810975 had been retired from service and now sat in a museum at the Air Force Academy, where it served as a reminder of the importance of accurate identification and clear communication in military operations. A plaque next to the aircraft told the story of the Bagram incident and its aftermath, ensuring that future generations of military officers would understand the lessons that had been learned at such a high cost. For Captain Sarah Mitchell, now Major Sarah Mitchell after her promotion, the aircraft represented both the worst and best moments of her military career. It was a reminder of how quickly routine operations could turn deadly, but also of how dedicated people could work together to prevent future tragedies and save lives. As she looked forward to her next assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that her service had made a real difference in the safety and effectiveness of American military operations around the world.